My husband's mother moved into our house after I gave birth and told everyone I was an unfit mother so she could raise my daughter herself. Constance moved into our guest house 3 days after I gave birth. She didn't ask permission. She showed up with a moving truck, professional movers, and a decorator while I was upstairs trying to figure out how to breastfeed. Julian told me his mother wanted to help during this difficult transition, and we should be grateful she was willing to put her life on hold for us. Grateful. I stared at him holding our screaming daughter wrong, not supporting her head properly, looking panicked and useless. Constance swept in and took the baby from him with practiced efficiency. She positioned my daughter at my breast with firm hands and said she'd hired a lactation consultant, a night nurse, and a baby nutritionist. All professionals she'd vetted and paid for. She'd already set up the nursery monitoring system and installed cameras in every room where the baby would spend time. For safety and optimal development tracking, she explained, she'd researched the best pediatrician in the state and made our first appointment. She'd purchased a year's worth of organic baby supplies and had contractors coming Monday to renovate the nursery with non-toxic materials and proper sound dampening. She'd done all this without consulting me once. When I tried to say I wanted to choose my own pediatrician, Constance smiled and said, new mothers often felt overwhelmed by decisions, and that's why experienced guidance was so valuable. Julian nodded agreement. I looked at my daughter, latched to my breast, and realized I was already losing her to my mother-in-law's money and control. The night nurse started that evening. Marissa had 15 years of experience with elite families and deferred to Constance on every decision. They'd established a feeding schedule, sleep training protocol, and developmental milestone tracking system before I was even consulted. Marissa took my daughter to the nursery at 8 p.m., and I didn't see her again until 7 a.m. Constance explained this arrangement would let me recover properly from birth. She said most women would be grateful for uninterrupted sleep and professional care. When I said I wanted to do the night feedings myself, Constance exchanged a look with Marissa that I couldn't decipher. She said we'd discuss it once I was thinking more clearly and not so hormonal. Julian went back to work at his investment banking firm 3 days later. Constance stayed. Every morning she was in the nursery before I woke up. She'd already fed the baby, changed her, and started tummy time exercises the nutritionist recommended. She documented everything in a leather-bound journal with times, amounts, and developmental observations. When I tried to hold my daughter, Constance would allow it briefly but then take her back, saying it was time for her developmental activity schedule. At 1 week old, my daughter had a more structured routine than I'd had my entire adult life. Constance had created feeding charts, sleep logs, and milestone checklists that hung in the nursery like hospital records. Every aspect of my daughter's existence was monitored and optimized by my mother-in-law and her hired team. The first doctor's appointment happened without me. I woke up at 9 a.m. to find Constance and Marissa gone with the baby. Julian was already at work. I called him panicking, and he said his mother texted him that the pediatrician had an opening and she didn't want to wake me since I'd been so tired. When they returned, Constance handed me a packet of papers from the appointment. She'd answered all the doctor's questions, provided family medical history, and made decisions about vaccination schedules. The doctor had noted her as the primary caregiver contact. When I said I should have been there, Constance said the doctor's office was very understanding about mothers who were struggling with postpartum adjustment. Struggling. I wasn't struggling. I was being systematically excluded from my own daughter's care. That night, I told Julian I wanted Constance to leave. He looked at me like I'd suggested burning down the house. He said his mother was providing incredible support that most families could never afford. She'd spent over $50,000 on baby equipment, staff, and medical care in just 2 weeks. He said I was being ungrateful and hormonal. He said his mother had experience and resources that would give our daughter the best possible start in life. He said I should be focusing on recovering instead of creating family conflict. Then he went to the guest house to have dinner with his mother, while I ate leftover takeout alone in our bedroom. I pumped breast milk with a hospital-grade pump Constance had purchased and listened to my daughter crying in the nursery with Marissa. I wasn't allowed in during sleep training hours. Constance's rules. Constance started hosting playgroups at our house when my daughter was 3 weeks old. She invited wealthy mothers from her social circle with babies around the same age. I came downstairs one morning to find 10 women in my living room, babies on designer playmats, catered lunch being served by staff I hadn't hired. Constance was holding my daughter in the center of the circle, explaining her development philosophy and the team of experts she'd assembled. One woman asked if I was the nanny. Constance laughed and said no. That's the mother. But she's very young and still adjusting. She's been letting me handle most of the hands-on care since she's finding it all a bit overwhelming. The women nodded sympathetically. One said how lucky I was to have such an involved grandmother. Another said most new mothers would kill for this kind of support. Constance smiled and said she'd made mistakes with Julian by being too career-focused during his early years. This time she was doing it right. She was going to be the grandmother she wished she'd been as a mother. She held my daughter up and said genetic second chances were a blessing. I stood in the doorway of my own living room, watching these women treat my mother-in-law as my daughter's primary parent. No one asked me questions about feeding or sleep or development. They asked Constance. She answered with authority, citing research from the specialists she'd hired. When my daughter started crying, I stepped forward to take her. But Constance was already standing, already walking to the nursery. already soothing her with practiced movements. The other mothers watched her go with admiration. One told me I should soak up this time to rest before Constance eventually went back to her own life. I wanted to scream that Constance had moved into our guest house and showed no signs of leaving. I found the recordings by accident. I was looking for my daughter's birth certificate in Constance's guest house while she was at the pediatrician for the 1-month checkup that I wasn't invited to. I found a laptop open on her desk with files labeled by date. I clicked one and saw security footage from our nursery. Me standing over the crib crying at 3 a.m. when Marissa wouldn't let me feed my own daughter. Another video showed me in the kitchen on my phone looking exhausted while my daughter cried in the background. Another showed me snapping at Julian about his mother's control. There were dozens of clips, all carefully edited to show me at my worst moments. New parent exhaustion framed as incompetence. Normal stress framed as instability. I kept clicking and found documents. Research on grandparents' rights. Names of family law attorneys. A drafted letter outlining concerns about maternal fitness. Constance was building a custody case using security footage from cameras she'd installed in my house. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of everything on that screen. File names, video timestamps, attorney contacts, legal research. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. Then I heard a car door. Constance was back. I closed the laptop and ran out through the guest house back door. She never knew I'd been inside. That night, I lay in bed next to Julian pretending to sleep while my mind raced. Constance wasn't just helping. She was systematically replacing me as my daughter's mother and documenting my inadequacy to make it legal. I called a family lawyer the next morning from a coffee shop. Her name was Diana Roth, and she'd handled high-stakes custody cases for 20 years. I told her everything. The guest house takeover, the hired staff, the edited security footage, the grandparents' rights research. Diana listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said Constance was building what's called a de facto parent case. By establishing herself as the primary caregiver through consistent presence, financial investment, and decision-making authority, she could argue she'd become essential to the child's welfare. The security footage would be used to show I was unfit or unstable. With Constance's wealth, social connections, and documented involvement in every aspect of my daughter's care for the first critical weeks, a judge might actually grant her substantial custody rights. Diana said grandparent custody cases were rare but not impossible, especially when the grandparent could prove the biological mother was unable to provide adequate care. I asked what I should do. Diana said I needed to document everything immediately. Every decision Constance made without consulting me. Every appointment she attended alone. Every time she referred to herself as the primary caregiver. Every dollar she spent creating financial dependency. I needed to reclaim my role as mother visibly and consistently. And I needed to get Constance out of that guest house before she established permanent residency. Diana said this would get ugly fast once Constance realized I was pushing back. Women like her didn't give up control easily, especially when they believed they were doing the right thing. I started documenting everything that day. Every time Constance overrode my decisions. Every time she took my daughter somewhere without telling me. Every time she referred to herself as the primary caregiver in front of others. I kept a detailed journal with dates, times, and witnesses. I started attending every appointment whether Constance wanted me there or not. At the 2-month checkup, I walked into the exam room where Constance was already talking to the pediatrician. The doctor looked surprised to see me. Constance said she'd told me the appointment wasn't until next week. I showed the doctor my phone with the correct appointment time and said I was the mother and would be answering all questions about my daughter's care. Constance's face went rigid. She said the doctor preferred consistency in who provided medical history. The doctor looked uncomfortable and said actually parents were always the primary contact. I answered every question. I provided feeding information. I discussed sleep patterns. Constance tried to interject corrections, but I kept talking. The doctor noted everything I said and changed the primary contact to my name. When we left, Constance told me I'd embarrassed myself by undermining her established relationship with the pediatrician. I told her I was the mother and she was the grandmother and those roles weren't interchangeable. She looked at me with something cold in her eyes and said, inexperienced mothers often made mistakes that affected their children's well-being. She hoped I understood the responsibility I was claiming. That night, Constance had dinner with Julian at the guest house without inviting me. They were in there for 3 hours. When Julian came back, he said we needed to talk. His mother was concerned about my behavior at the doctor's appointment. She felt I was being hostile and uncooperative. She'd invested significant time and money into ensuring our daughter got the best care, and I was undermining her efforts. Julian said his mother was just trying to help and I was being defensive and difficult. I asked him if he thought it was normal that his mother had moved into our property without asking. If he thought it was normal that she'd hired an entire staff without consulting me. If he thought it was normal that she attended medical appointments without me and made all decisions about our daughter's care. Julian said his mother had experience and resources we didn't have. She knew what she was doing because she regretted not being more involved when he was a baby. This was her second chance to do motherhood right. I stared at him and realized he genuinely didn't see anything wrong with his mother taking over our daughter's life. He saw it as generous support, not hostile takeover. I asked if he knew his mother had been researching grandparents' rights and family law attorneys. Julian's face changed. He said I was being paranoid and his mother would never do something like that. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken of her laptop, the file names, the legal research, the attorney contacts. He stared at the screen and his face went pale. Then he said there must be an explanation. His mother was probably just researching in case something happened to us. Estate planning. I asked why she'd need videos of me looking exhausted and stressed if this was about estate planning. Julian didn't answer. Constance called a family meeting the next morning. She, Julian, and I sat in our living room while Marissa took my daughter to the nursery. Constance said she was concerned about the growing tension in the household. She felt I was struggling with postpartum adjustment and perhaps needed professional help. She'd researched excellent therapists who specialized in maternal mental health. She said it was nothing to be ashamed of. Many women struggled after birth, and the important thing was getting proper treatment. She looked at Julian for support. He looked at me with worry. I realized Constance was reframing my pushback as mental illness. If I refused therapy, I looked unstable. If I accepted, I validated her concern that something was wrong with me. It was a perfect trap. I told Constance I wasn't struggling with postpartum issues. I was struggling with my mother-in-law moving into my house, hiring staff without my consent, making all decisions about my daughter's care, and attending medical appointments without me. Constance's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. She said defensive anger was often a symptom of deeper issues. She'd been documenting concerning behaviors for weeks in case professional evaluation became necessary. Julian asked what behaviors. Constance listed them. My 3 a.m. crying in the nursery. My frustration when the baby wouldn't stop screaming. My arguments with Julian about his mother's involvement. My hostile behavior at the pediatrician's office. Every normal new mother stress moment had been recorded and cataloged as evidence of unfitness. I called Diana from my car that afternoon. She said Constance was escalating faster than expected. The therapy suggestion was strategic. If I went, anything I said could be used against me. If I refused, Constance would use that refusal as evidence I was denying needed treatment. Diana said we needed to act fast. She'd draft a formal letter to Constance requiring her to vacate the guest house within 30 days. We'd document that she was no longer welcome to make medical decisions or attend appointments without my explicit permission. We'd revoke her access to the house unless I was present. We'd terminate all the staff she'd hired. It would be aggressive but necessary to reestablish my parental authority before Constance's de facto parent claim became stronger. Diana said I needed Julian's support for this to work. If he sided with his mother, this would become a divorce and custody battle where Constance could testify against me. I went home and found Julian in his office. I told him everything Diana said. I told him his mother was building a custody case. I told him I needed him to choose his wife and daughter over his mother's control. Julian looked torn. He said his mother had been generous and supportive. I said his mother had been invasive and manipulative. I asked him directly, "Do you want your mother raising our daughter, or do you want us to be parents?" He didn't answer right away. That hesitation told me everything about where his loyalty actually lay. Finally, he said he'd talk to his mother and figure out a compromise. I told him there was no compromise. Either Constance left, or I would take our daughter and leave. Julian's face hardened. He said I couldn't take his daughter anywhere. I said, "Watch me." That night, I packed bags for me and the baby and called Diana. She said leaving might be interpreted as abandonment and could hurt me in custody proceedings. I unpacked. I was trapped in my own house with a mother-in-law systematically taking my child and a husband too loyal to his mother to protect his wife. Julian's talk with his mother didn't go how I hoped. He came back and said Constance was hurt by my accusations, but willing to make some adjustments. She'd move back to our own house in 3 weeks after we found permanent staff to help with childcare. She'd continue paying for the professionals she'd hired, but I could attend all appointments. She'd stop hosting playgroups at our house without my permission. Julian presented this like a generous compromise. I said it wasn't enough. Constance needed to leave immediately and all her hired staff needed to go. Julian said I was being unreasonable. His mother had spent over $80,000 on support services and I wanted to throw it all away out of pride. I said I wanted to be my daughter's mother instead of a bystander in my own life. Julian said if I fired Marissa and the other professionals, I'd be responsible for all night feedings and care alone since he had to work. He said it like a threat, like I should be grateful his mother's money relieved me of actual parenting. I told Julian I wanted to be relieved of his mother, not my daughter. He said I was being selfish and thinking about my feelings instead of what was best for the baby. I asked when he'd decided his mother knew better than me about what our daughter needed. He said when his mother's demonstrated expertise and resources proved she did. We didn't speak for 2 days after that. Constance started her exit strategy by introducing me as overwhelmed and unstable in front of witnesses. At a playgroup she hosted despite our fight, she told the other mothers I'd been having a difficult adjustment and had become somewhat hostile toward help. She said it gently with concern coding every word. The women looked at me with pity. One asked if I was seeing someone for postpartum issues. Another said her sister had similar problems and medication really helped. Constance nodded and said she'd suggested therapy, but I'd been resistant. She worried about what that resistance meant for the baby's safety. I stood there watching my mother-in-law poison these women against me with careful words and concerned expressions. Later that day, one of the mothers called Constance within my earshot asking if she was worried about the baby's well-being given the mother's instability. Constance said she was monitoring the situation closely and had consulted attorneys about what options existed if things deteriorated further. She said it loud enough for me to hear from the next room. She wanted me to know she was building her case publicly now, not just privately. I recorded the conversation on my phone. Diana said it was good evidence of Constance's campaign to establish herself as the concerned, capable grandmother protecting a child from an unfit mother. We were building our own case, but Constance had a head start and deeper pockets. Diana asked if I had any independent financial resources. I didn't. Julian controlled all our money, and his mother was wealthier than both of us combined. The breaking point came during a family dinner at Constance's main house. She'd invited Julian's aunt, uncle, and cousins to meet the baby. I dressed carefully and got there early, determined to be present and engaged. Constance met me at the door and took my daughter from my arms before I was fully inside. She carried her to the living room where the family was waiting. For the next 3 hours, Constance held my daughter. Every time I reached for her, Constance was already moving away or handing her to another family member. When the baby started crying, Constance took her to a bedroom and closed the door. I followed and found Constance changing my daughter's diaper while explaining to Julian's aunt that I'd been struggling with basic care tasks and she'd been handling most of the hands-on parenting. The aunt nodded and said it was wonderful that Constance could step in during this difficult time. I said I wasn't struggling with care tasks. Constance had simply taken over without letting me parent. Constance looked at the aunt with a sad expression and said defensive reactions were common with postpartum issues. The aunt touched my arm sympathetically and said it was okay to need help. I wasn't alone. I looked at Constance holding my daughter and realized she'd spent the entire evening establishing in front of Julian's extended family that she was the capable grandmother rescuing a baby from an inadequate mother. Every family member there would testify to Constance's primary caregiver role if this went to court. It was a performance, and I'd been cast as the unstable supporting character. I confronted Julian in the car on the way home. I told him his mother had just spent 3 hours demonstrating to his entire family that I was an unfit mother. He said I was being paranoid. His family was just trying to be supportive. I asked why his mother wouldn't let me hold my own daughter for 3 hours. Julian said his mother was excited to show off the baby, and I was being possessive. I told him about the laptop files, the security footage, the attorney research, the carefully orchestrated narrative of my unfitness. Julian pulled the car over, and we sat in a grocery store parking lot while I showed him everything I'd documented. Every appointment Constance attended without me. Every decision she made without consulting me. Every dollar she spent establishing financial control. Every comment she made positioning herself as primary caregiver. Julian stared at my phone for a long time. Then he said his mother was just trying to help in the only way she knew how, with money and control. He said she'd been a largely absent mother to him, and this was her attempt to do better. I asked at what point does helping become taking over? At what point does a grandmother's second chance become erasing the actual mother? Julian said I was overreacting. His mother would eventually go back to her own life and we'd have our space back. I asked when. He didn't know. I asked if he'd support me in making her leave immediately. He said he couldn't do that to his mother after everything she'd done for us. I realized then that Julian would never choose me over Constance. His mother's approval and financial support mattered more than his wife's autonomy or his daughter's actual mother. I moved into the guest bedroom that night. I took my daughter with me despite Marissa's protests that it would disrupt the sleep schedule. I locked the door and held my baby for the first time in hours. She looked at me with unfocused eyes and I cried into her blanket. I'd carried her for 9 months. I'd gone through labor and delivery. She'd come from my body. And somehow in 8 weeks, my mother-in-law had convinced everyone, including my husband, that I wasn't capable of caring for her. I checked my phone and found messages from Constance. She was concerned about my emotional state. She'd like to talk in the morning about getting me professional help. She'd made calls to highly recommended therapists and could have someone here by afternoon. Every message was documented concern. Every word could be used in court to show she'd tried to help and I'd been uncooperative. I called Diana at 11 p.m. She answered, sounding awake. I told her I needed to file for divorce and full custody immediately. Diana said filing would trigger Constance's custody action faster. We needed to be strategic. She asked if I had somewhere to go. I didn't. My parents lived 6 hours away and I had no money of my own. Diana said stay in the house. Document everything. Don't give Constance any ammunition. We'd file next week with evidence of her campaign to replace me. In the meantime, I needed to be the most present, capable mother possible so no judge could question my fitness. Constance escalated the next morning. She brought 2 people with her when she came to the main house. One was a therapist. One was a social worker. She knocked on my bedroom door and said she'd arranged for professional evaluation because she was concerned for the baby's safety. I opened the door holding my daughter and told them all to leave. The therapist said she just wanted to talk and make sure everyone was okay. Constance said she'd explained the situation and the concerning behaviors she'd observed. The social worker introduced herself as Sandra from Family Services. She said she'd received a call about a mother experiencing postpartum mental health crisis and wanted to do a welfare check. I looked at Constance and understood. She'd reported me. She'd used her social connections to get a social worker to my house based on her manufactured concerns. I told Sandra I was fine. My daughter was fine. My mother-in-law had moved into my house without permission and taken over my daughter's care, and I was trying to reclaim my parental role. Sandra looked at Constance. Constance said with concern coding every word that my hostile attitude toward help was part of the pattern. She'd been trying to provide support, and I'd been increasingly paranoid and defensive. She'd documented everything because she was worried. Sandra asked to see where the baby slept. I showed her the nursery with all of Constance's equipment and monitoring systems. Sandra asked who set this all up. I said my mother-in-law without my permission. Constance said she'd furnished the nursery as a gift and hired qualified professionals because I'd been overwhelmed. Sandra wrote notes. She asked to see my daughter's medical records. I didn't have them. Constance did. She'd been the one taking her to appointments. Sandra spent 2 hours at the house. She interviewed me, Constance, and Julian separately. She examined the nursery, the cameras, the staff schedule Constance had created. She looked at Constance's journal documenting every aspect of my daughter's care. She watched Constance interact with the baby with practiced efficiency. She watched me hold my daughter with exhausted desperation. When she finished, Sandra said she'd file a report, but didn't see immediate danger. However, she recommended strongly that I engage with mental health services and accept the support being offered. She said new mothers often struggled to accept help, and that resistance could indicate deeper issues. She'd be checking back in 2 weeks. After she left, Constance told me she'd done what any responsible grandmother would do when concerned about a child's welfare. She'd protected her granddaughter. If I was angry about that, it proved I wasn't thinking clearly. Julian stood in the kitchen looking torn. I asked if he understood what his mother had just done. She'd reported me to social services with fabricated concerns to create an official record of my unfitness. He said his mother was just worried. I said his mother was building a custody case and he was helping her do it. Julian said I needed to calm down, and maybe the therapist could actually help. I told him I didn't need therapy. I needed my mother-in-law out of my house and my husband to act like my partner instead of his mother's ally. Julian said he couldn't choose between his wife and his mother. I told him he just did. He chose her. I called Diana immediately. She said the social services visit was a serious escalation, and we needed to file now. She'd draft emergency motions establishing my parental rights and getting Constance out of the house. It would be expensive and ugly. I told her I didn't care. Diana said she'd need a retainer. I didn't have money. Diana said she'd take the case on contingency with payment coming from the divorce settlement. We'd file for divorce and full custody tomorrow. She'd include evidence of Constance's campaign to replace me and Julian's failure to protect my parental authority. She said I needed to prepare for Constance and Julian to fight back with their combined resources. They'd paint me as unstable and unfit. They'd use Sandra's visit as evidence of legitimate concern. This would get worse before it got better. I said it couldn't get worse than my mother-in-law having more rights to my daughter than I did. Diana said actually it could. If I lost the custody case, I might only get supervised visitation while Constance and Julian had primary custody. I needed to understand the stakes. I said I understood. My daughter was at stake. That was the only thing that mattered. Diana said she'd have papers ready by morning. We'd serve Julian at work and Constance at her house simultaneously. Then things would move fast. I spent that night holding my daughter and trying not to think about losing her to my mother-in-law's money and manipulation. The papers were served at 10 a.m. the next morning. Julian called me screaming from his office. I was destroying the family. I was being selfish and vindictive. His mother had done nothing but help, and I was attacking her. I asked if he'd read the evidence attachments, the security footage file names, the attorney research, the documented campaign to establish herself as primary caregiver, the social services report she'd orchestrated. Julian went quiet. Then he said there must be explanations for all of it. His mother wasn't malicious. I told him to ask her to explain why she'd been researching grandparents' rights and family law attorneys since before our daughter was even born. Julian said he'd talk to her. I told him too late. I'd already filed. He had 30 days to respond. Then I hung up. Constance arrived at my house an hour later. She walked in without knocking. She found me in the nursery feeding my daughter. She looked at me with cold rage that she didn't bother hiding anymore. She said I'd made a serious mistake. Did I think I could go against her resources and connections? Did I understand she had friends in family court? Did I comprehend what she could do to me? I told her to get out of my house. She said this house was paid for with Julian's money, which came from his trust fund, which she controlled. I was living in her property, raising her granddaughter with her resources. I had nothing without her. I told her I had my daughter, and that was enough. Constance smiled and said, "Enjoy it while it lasts." Then she left. I locked every door and called Diana. She said Constance's threat about the house was real. If the property was in Julian's name and he sided with his mother, I could be evicted. We needed to move fast on custody before Constance had time to deploy her full legal and financial arsenal. The custody hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Diana said that was actually fast for family court, but 3 weeks with Constance and Julian aligned against me would be brutal. She was right. Julian moved into the guest house with his mother. They hired a prestigious family law firm. They filed counter motions painting me as an unstable mother who'd rejected professional help and attacked the grandmother who'd generously provided support. They subpoenaed Sandra's social services report. They submitted Constance's journal documenting my supposed inadequacies. They got affidavits from the playgroup mothers saying Constance had expressed concerns about my fitness. They even got a statement from Marissa saying I'd been resistant to proper care protocols. Diana countered with my documentation, the photos of Constance's laptop files, the recordings of her positioning herself as primary caregiver, the evidence that she'd moved in without permission and taken over every aspect of my daughter's care, the proof that Julian had never supported my parental authority. Diana said it would come down to which narrative the judge believed. Was I a struggling mother rescued by a capable grandmother, or a mother whose rights were systematically violated by a controlling in-law? Diana said family court judges tended to favor established caregivers. Constance had been the consistent presence in my daughter's life since birth. That would work in her favor unless we could prove her involvement was hostile rather than helpful. The burden of proof was on me. The 3 weeks before the hearing were psychological warfare. Constance had her lawyers send daily demands. I needed to allow supervised visitation with the baby. I needed to agree to co-parenting with her and Julian. I needed to submit to psychiatric evaluation. Every demand was designed to establish that I was the problem and they were the reasonable ones trying to solve it. When I refused, Constance filed emergency motions claiming I was denying the baby access to her father and putting her at risk through my instability. The judge ordered temporary custody evaluation. A court-appointed evaluator named Dr. Phillips came to observe me with my daughter. He asked about my relationship with Constance. I explained everything. He took notes and asked if I had proof. I showed him my documentation. He said he'd need to observe Constance with the baby too for comparison. That observation happened at Constance's house with all her equipment and her staff and her carefully staged environment. Dr. Phillips saw Constance interact with my daughter with practiced skill and expensive resources. He saw me interact with exhausted authenticity in my temporary situation. His preliminary report noted that both parties showed appropriate care, but the grandmother had more established routines and professional support systems. Diana said that report was bad for us. It validated Constance's position that she was a stable resource. We needed something stronger for the hearing. I asked what. Diana said we needed Constance to admit what she'd been doing. We needed her to reveal her actual intentions on record. I asked how we'd make that happen. Diana said she had an idea. Diana's idea was risky. She'd have an investigator approach Constance posing as a family law attorney specializing in grandparents' rights. He'd tell Constance he'd heard about her case and thought he could help her win full custody. He'd record the conversation. If Constance admitted her real motivations and strategies, we'd have direct evidence of her hostile takeover attempt. It was ethically questionable and might not be admissible, but it was our best shot at proving intent. I agreed. The investigator's name was Marcus Levine, and he'd worked similar cases. He contacted Constance's attorney saying he wanted to consult on grandparents' rights strategy. Constance agreed to meet him. The recording from that meeting was damning. Constance told Marcus she'd been planning this since her daughter-in-law got pregnant. She knew from experience that new mothers were vulnerable and overwhelmed. She'd positioned herself as helpful, while actually establishing primary caregiver status. She'd documented every moment of her daughter-in-law's weakness to build her case. She'd used her social connections to get credible witnesses. She'd spent money to create dependency. She'd even orchestrated the social services visit to get an official record of concern. Everything had been calculated to replace her daughter-in-law as her granddaughter's mother. This was her second chance to do motherhood right, and nobody was taking it from her. Marcus asked if she felt any conflict about taking a child from its mother. Constance said biology didn't make someone a mother. Capability did. Her daughter-in-law wasn't capable. She was. Therefore, she was the real mother, regardless of who gave birth. The recording was 45 minutes of Constance laying out exactly what she'd done and why. Diana said it might not be admissible, but we'd find a way to use it. The custody hearing started on a Monday morning. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Judge Barbara Reeves presided. She was in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for drama. Both sides presented opening statements. Constance's lawyer painted her as a devoted grandmother who'd stepped in when she saw a struggling mother and now wanted to ensure the child's continued well-being. Diana painted Constance as a controlling in-law who'd systematically violated my parental rights and manufactured evidence of unfitness. Judge Reeves said she'd hear testimony and review evidence before making any determinations. Constance testified first. She was poised and sympathetic. She talked about her regrets from Julian's childhood and her desire to be more present this time. She described moving into the guest house as temporary support that extended because the need was so great. She listed everything she'd provided: professional staff, medical care, equipment, education. She said she'd simply been trying to help and had become concerned when I resisted even basic support. She submitted her journal as evidence of consistent caregiving. Constance's lawyer asked if she'd ever intended to replace me as the mother. Constance said absolutely not. She'd only wanted to ensure the baby got proper care while I adjusted to motherhood. Judge Reeves asked pointed questions. Why did you attend medical appointments without the mother? Constance said, because I hadn't been ready to go alone, and she didn't want the baby to miss important checkups. Why did you make care decisions without consulting the mother? Constance said she'd consulted professionals who gave research-based recommendations, and she'd simply implemented them. Why did you host playgroups and introduce yourself as primary care? Constance said she'd never introduced herself that way. Other mothers had simply observed her hands-on involvement and drawn conclusions. Diana cross-examined Constance for 2 hours. She asked about the laptop files. Constance claimed she'd been doing research for estate planning purposes. Diana asked why estate planning research included videos of me looking stressed. Constance said the security cameras were for safety and any footage was incidental. Diana asked about the attorney contacts. Constance said she'd consulted attorneys about protecting the family's interests. Diana asked why protecting the family's interests required building evidence of my unfitness. Constance said she'd never built such evidence. Diana pulled out my documentation, showing every instance of Constance positioning herself as primary caregiver in front of witnesses. Constance explained each one away. She'd been excited to hold her grandchild. She'd been trying to give me breaks. She'd been responding to my requests for help. Diana showed the court Sandra's social services report. She asked Constance directly if she'd called family services. Constance said she'd expressed concern to someone who must have reported it independently. Diana asked who she'd expressed concern to. Constance named Sandra specifically. Diana asked if Constance and Sandra knew each other socially. Constance admitted they served on a charity board together. Diana asked if Constance had used her social connection to manufacture an official report of concern. Constance said she'd simply shared legitimate worries with a friend who had professional obligations. Judge Reeves told Diana to move on, but her expression suggested she'd noted the answer. Diana asked Constance what her long-term intentions were. Did she plan to eventually return to her own home and her own life? Constance said she planned to remain involved in her granddaughter's care for as long as necessary. Diana asked what necessary meant. Constance said until she was confident the child was receiving optimal care. Diana asked who determined what was optimal. Constance said professionals and experience. Diana asked if the biological mother's preferences mattered at all in Constance's definition of optimal care. Constance said of course they mattered, when they aligned with the child's best interests. Diana asked who determined the child's best interests. Constance paused, then said ultimately the courts did, which was why we were here. I testified next. Diana walked me through everything. The pregnancy and Constance's increasing involvement, the birth and her immediate takeover, moving into the guest house without permission, hiring staff I never approved, attending appointments without me, making all decisions without consulting me, the playgroups where she positioned herself as primary caregiver, the security cameras and footage, the laptop files and attorney research, the social services visit she'd orchestrated, every way Constance had systematically replaced me while framing it as help. I explained how trapped I'd felt in my own house, how I'd tried to reclaim my role and been labeled unstable, how Julian had sided with his mother at every turn, how I'd been excluded from my own daughter's life by people with more money and social power. I cried on the stand and didn't try to hide it. These weren't performed tears. They were exhaustion and rage and fear that I might actually lose my daughter to my mother-in-law's carefully constructed narrative. Constance's lawyer cross-examined me. He asked if Constance had ever prevented me from caring for my daughter. I said yes, constantly. He asked for specific instances where I'd been physically stopped. I described the night feedings Marissa handled. He said I'd allowed that arrangement. I said I'd been told it was necessary for proper development. He asked if Constance had forced me to accept professional help. I said she'd presented it as non-negotiable. He asked if I'd ever actually refused. I said I'd tried and been labeled unstable. He showed me the social services report and asked if I'd cooperated with Sandra's evaluation. I said yes because I had no choice. He asked if Sandra had found any immediate danger. No. Had Sandra recommended therapy? Yes. Had I engaged with therapy? No. Why not? Because my mother-in-law's therapist recommendations were part of her campaign to establish my unfitness. How did I know that? Because I'd seen her laptop files planning exactly that. Could I prove those files existed? I had photos on my phone. Diana submitted my phone photos into evidence. Constance's lawyer objected, saying I'd illegally accessed Constance's private computer. Judge Reeves asked how I'd obtained the photos. I explained I'd been in the guest house looking for my daughter's birth certificate and found the laptop open. The judge said the photos would be admitted as relevant regardless of how obtained. The files showed research on grandparents' rights, contact information for family law attorneys, and folders labeled with dates corresponding to security footage. Constance's lawyer argued this proved nothing except that Constance had been prudently researching her options. Diana said it proved premeditation. Constance hadn't been reacting to a struggling mother. She'd been planning a custody case from the beginning. Judge Reeves asked if there was any direct evidence of Constance stating her intentions. Diana looked at me. This was the moment. Diana said we had a recording of Constance meeting with a supposed grandparents' rights attorney. Constance's lawyer objected immediately. The recording was obtained through deception and wasn't admissible. Judge Reeves said she'd hear the recording in chambers before ruling on admissibility. We took a recess while the judge listened to Marcus's recording of Constance. When we returned, Judge Reeves looked serious. She said the recording had credibility issues but contained relevant statements. She'd allow portions of it as evidence of Constance's state of mind. Diana played the relevant sections in court. Constance's voice explaining how she'd planned everything from the pregnancy, how she'd positioned herself as helpful while establishing primary caregiver status, how she'd documented my weaknesses, how she'd used money and social connections to create dependency and credibility, how this was her second chance to do motherhood right and nobody would take it from her. The courtroom was silent. Constance's face was rigid. Julian looked shocked. Judge Reeves asked Constance if she'd made those statements. Constance said she'd been deceived by someone posing as an attorney and had made comments that were taken out of context. Judge Reeves said the context seemed quite clear. Judge Reeves recessed for 2 days to review all evidence. Diana said the recording was devastating for Constance's case, but we couldn't be certain how the judge would rule. Family court was unpredictable, and Constance still had the advantage of demonstrated resources and involvement. I went home to my locked bedroom with my daughter and waited. Julian tried to talk to me. He said he'd never known his mother had planned things this way. He'd genuinely thought she was just helping. I asked if he was capable of seeing his mother clearly, or if her money and control would always blind him. He said he didn't know. I told him to figure it out because I wasn't raising my daughter in a house where his mother had more authority than me. The 2 days felt like months. On Wednesday morning, we returned to court. Judge Reeves had her decision ready. She said this case troubled her deeply. Grandparents who provided support to struggling families were valuable. Grandparents who systematically undermined parents while disguising hostility as help were dangerous. The evidence showed Constance Ashworth had moved into her daughter-in-law's home without permission. She'd hired staff without consultation. She'd attended medical appointments without the mother. She'd made care decisions unilaterally. She'd hosted social events positioning herself as primary caregiver. She'd researched legal strategies for obtaining custody. She'd orchestrated an official social services visit to create a record of concern. And most damningly, she'd admitted in recorded conversation that all of this had been calculated to establish herself as the real mother. Judge Reeves said biology didn't automatically make someone a fit parent, but it did establish legal parental rights that couldn't be superseded by a grandmother's preference to have a do-over at motherhood. The court found no evidence that I was unfit, unstable, or incapable. The evidence showed I'd been systematically excluded from my daughter's care by someone with more resources and social power. Judge Reeves awarded me full legal and physical custody. Julian would have standard visitation rights as the father. Constance would have supervised visitation only, limited to 4 hours per month until she demonstrated respect for my parental authority. All Constance's hired staff were dismissed. All Constance's equipment could be removed from my home. Constance was to vacate the guest house within 48 hours. Judge Reeves said grandmothers had important roles in children's lives, but those roles didn't include replacing mothers. If Constance wanted a relationship with her granddaughter, she'd build it by respecting boundaries, not bulldozing them. The ruling was comprehensive and harsh and exactly what I needed. Constance sat rigid in her seat. Julian looked between his mother and me with visible conflict. I held my daughter and breathed properly for the first time in months. 6 months later, I'm living in a smaller house that I can actually afford with child support from Julian. We're divorced. He sees our daughter on weekends, and he's learning to be a father without his mother directing every decision. Constance attends supervised visits once a month. She brings expensive gifts and makes subtle comments about my parenting choices, but a court supervisor is always present to shut down any boundary violations. She'll never accept that she was wrong. She genuinely believed she was saving my daughter from an inadequate mother, but my daughter knows my voice, my touch, my smell. She reaches for me when she's scared. She calms in my arms. She's mine because I fought for her when everyone with money and power said I wasn't enough. Judge Reeves's ruling was clear. Grandmothers don't get do-overs by taking someone else's child. They get second chances by respecting that their time as primary parent is done. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.